afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first public lecture provided by International Coalition of NIDA in cooperation with the NIDA research centers. Today we are very delighted to welcome Professor Rudolf Krivers, who is the visiting professor at International Coalition of NIDA and also the full-time professor at UCL Antwerp in Belgium. Professor Rudolf has been working in lots of research in international economics and international business areas in both in ASEAN and also in EU. So I would say Professor Rudolph's thought of the view today will be very beneficial not only to EU but also in Thailand itself to be will be a partner of ASEAN or fully ASEAN in the future. Professor Rudolph is Professor Emeritus at University of Antwerp in Belgium. He also served lots of positions as Director of Center of ASEAN Studies at University of Antwerp and Extraordinary Professor of Northwest Universities in South Africa. Associate Research Fellow at United Nations University, Center of Regional Integration Studies in Belgium, and also Chairman of European Institute of Asian Studies in Belgium. Now is a good opportunity that I would like to invite Associate Professor the Vice President of Research and Consulting at NIDA, to have the opening remarks. Please.
Good afternoon, Professor Rudolf Krivers, faculty member, honoraries, guests, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, we would like to welcome all you to the NIDA Academic Forum. Our NIDA Academic Forum is highly honored to have Professor Rudolf Krivers from University of Antwerp, Belgium, and visiting Professor of International College of NIDA to present his work under the topic EU and ASEAN Future FTA Partner or State Fellows. Now I would like to give the floor to Professor Rudolf Krivers to present his work. Last, I wish this forum have a success. Thanks so much for your supporting. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So the topic of my talk today is ASEAN and EU Future FTA Partners or strange bedfellows. Maybe I have to explain a bit about that title, but let me first, after already some introduction, let me very briefly introduce myself again, because I have to give at least a couple of qualifications. One of the qualifications is, first of all, I am officially a retired professor from the University of Antwerp. Although I'm still teaching there, I reached the age of retirement, so I had to go. But I'm not really going at all. I'm still staying there. As you see, I'm still teaching, but I'm also director of the Center for ASEAN Studies. And I would like to invite you, really, if you have the chance to visit the website of the University of Antwerp and go to the website of the Center for ASEAN Studies, you might find maybe some studies that you will find interesting, which are freely downloadable, so there is no copyright or whatsoever involved. The second, extraordinary professor at Northwest University in South Africa. Well, there is nothing extraordinary about that position. It just means part-time over there, so it's not extraordinary at all. Associate Research Fellow. Well, that's the last year. Now, maybe I have to explain a bit about the European Institute for Asian Studies, because that's a think tank in Brussels, mainly doing all kinds of research and support and consulting for embassies and diplomats from Asian countries, as well as for the European institutions, the European Parliament, the European Commission as well. So this is a bit what I wanted to qualify with respect to the introduction, just to make sure that, well, not to a wrong picture is given of me, because especially that extraordinary professor, there is nothing extraordinary about that. So, the line of my talk today, first of all, I'm going to compare a bit ASEAN and the EU. Then the next chapter, so to speak, in my talk is what I called, following the Beatles, the long and winding road to EU and ASEAN FTA. Then I'm going to focus a bit on the status at this moment of the EU-ASEAN negotiations, especially in order to go then to some conclusions or to some lessons that Thailand can draw from it. And in the end, I will also talk a bit about the position of the poor economies in ASEAN, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, in that process. But maybe there is some need to explain, to go back to the title and explain, well, we all know, I guess, what FTA means, a free trade agreement. So we're talking about future partners in a free trade agreement, EU-ASEAN free trade agreement. Second, I have to say something about the strange bedfellows. Well, strange bedfellows goes back to William Shakespeare's play The Tempest, which was first on the scene in 1611, so, well, quite some time ago, where there is a statement there in that play, misery acquaints the man with strange bedfellows. Well, this is not the interpretation of the strange bedfellows that I'm using. I'm rather referring to a play, a Broadway play by Neil Simon of 1965, The Odd Couple, where we have two guys, Felix and Oscar, who are sharing the same apartment. But one is freaky, messy, and the other is freaky, tidy, and so that's why they are called strange bedfellows. And so this is my interpretation. It's up to you to find out who EU or ASEAN is the freaky, tidy one and who is the freaky, well, the other guy. I'm not going into that. So let's first compare a bit EU and ASEAN. Well, if you look at population and area, they are more or less comparable. ASEAN has some 100 million people more in population, which of course is quite a lot, but it's not that much different from the EU. The area is also somewhat larger, but if you look in more detail at the economic parameters of the two groups of countries, they differ widely, of course. So this is one reason to call them strange bedfellows. First of all, the combined GDP for all the EU countries together, the 27 EU countries together, is almost 8 times the gross domestic product, the combined gross domestic product of the 10 ASEAN countries. Second, total trade of the EU with the rest of the world is about double, not really double, but about double that of the ASEAN group of countries. Now, of course, these figures are biased because total trade, for instance, incorporates quite a lot of intra-EU trade, but you also have, of course, intra-ASEAN trade, which is incorporated in these figures. But of course, when we talk about ASEAN, we talk only about 10 countries, whereas when we talk about the EU, we talk about 27 countries. So there is a bias in this figure. But what is strikingly different, of course, is that the EU today is in a recession. Growth rates, economic growth rate of 2012 was minus 0.3, whereas ASEAN as a group and also the individual countries is a booming region, is growing rapidly and has been growing rapidly quite some time, unlike the EU. So again, this might be a reason to call them strange bedfellows in the interpretation not of William Shakespeare, but rather of the American playwright. There are also differences between the two groups of countries in terms of historical creed, what I would like to call historical creed, how they started, as a matter of fact. Well, first of all, the EU, the EU, Europe, let's say Western Europe, was for quite a long time a battlefield. 2 world wars were taking place there, devastating impact. And so after the Second World War, a number of political leaders in Germany and France decided, well, this should not happen again. We have to do something. And what is the basis at that time of modern warfare? Well, that's heavy industry, that's steel, that's coal mines. So we have to bring steel and coal mines under a supranational body controlling and regulating heavy industries. So from the beginning there was this idea we have to use economic integration as an instrument to increase the prospects for peace. And there was a second important aspect to which we will refer a couple of times, namely that from the start it was decided to give up, the national economies or the countries to give up some of their autonomy, some of their policy authority in important economic fields to a supranational body. Right. So this was the start of the EU in the early 50s actually. I'm now talking about the Economic Community for Coal and Steel, not about the European Economic Community, which started in 1957 with the Treaty of Rome. That's the next step basically. Now ASEAN started completely different. Well, it was also related to war. In the middle of the 1960s there was the Vietnam War, which was getting out of hand in a sense, and there was a real danger and a risk that the war was going to spread to other Southeast Asian economies. It started already to spread into Cambodia, and to some extent also in Laos. So there was a danger it was going to spread further. And the problem at that time was that there were a number of national leaders who had their own development agenda for their country, who wanted to pursue that development agenda, and the only way to pursue that development agenda was to remain autonomous and to contain communist threat in the region. And so this was a major reason, not the only reason, but let's say the major reason for creating ASEAN, for the Bangkok Declaration of 1967. This also, what I'm saying now, this type of historical creed also immediately leads to the fact that the ASEAN countries, they are very to say the least, reluctant to give up national autonomy over policy issues. They want to stay to a large extent independent. They want to integrate, but they don't want to give too much autonomy or authority to a supranational body. That's why today ASEAN has created the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. Of course, it's on its way to the ASEAN Economic Community, of which I will talk immediately a bit further. Right, so this again summarizes a bit what I was saying. The basic message with the creation of ASEAN was a bit from the perspective of the leaders of the various countries, was a bit, leave me alone to run my country. Whereas the perspective from the European leaders, national leaders, was make sure that no one is ever going to be left alone again. Right, so this, and then of course, development went further, and also after a while there was also in ASEAN increasingly talk about economic integration, not just cooperation. Economic integration, which first took the form in the late 1970s and in the 1980s in the form of a number of economic cooperation programs in terms of investment, promotion, and so on and so forth. Right? Now the idea in 1992 of having the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement was not like a similar evolution in the EU in the end to have a customs union, a monetary union, and in the end even a political union. No, in 1992 when AFTA was signed, was starting, the idea was to have bigger impact in international negotiations, more to speak with one voice in international negotiations, not to be left behind because at that time quite a lot of investment was going into China, and there was really very much fear that the ASEAN countries, which had attracted a lot of foreign investment before, were going to lose out in this process. So the idea basically of AFTA at that time was not to end up with the ASEAN Economic Community, which we are going to have in 2015. The idea was to have bigger clout and footprint with the West, with China, and also with India. Now, looking deeper into the two groups of countries, what can we further take into account? Well, on this slide you will see two aspects that are important further to analyze these groups of countries. First is gross national income per capita, the income per head of the population. On average, it gives you an idea how rich people are, individual people in the country, on average of course, and the same for ASEAN. The second indicator is the Human Development Index. This is a kind of index which was created by the United Nations to try to evaluate progress in terms of human development. Now there is some overlap between the two, between GNI per capita, gross national income per head of the population on the one hand, and the Human Development Index, because gross national income per capita is part of the Human Development Index. But apart from that, human development is also reflecting progress in education, progress in health, provisions, and so on and so forth. So it is much more than just income per head of the population. Now, in order to look into the tensions within a group of countries, I mean, the wider the gap within a group of countries in terms of income per head of the population, the more tension there is in a group. That's what you might expect. That's at least what I would like to assume. Now, the poorest country in the EU in terms of income per head of the population is Bulgaria, 6.6 thousand US dollars per capita. The richest country is Denmark, 60,000 US dollars per capita per head of the population. So this is something like the ratio of the two is something 1 to 10. In ASEAN, the poorest country is Cambodia with an income per head of the population of a bit more than 800, as compared to Singapore, which is a developed economy, 42,000 US dollars. So here you see almost a ratio of 1 to 50. Now, of course, when people in a country on average are poor, as compared to countries where the people on average are rich, their interests and their capacities of joining negotiations and free trade agreements and economic integration processes and so on, their interests are different. They want to have something different from what the poorer want to have something different from what the richer people want. Now the same with respect to the Human Development Index. The country with the highest Human Development Index in Europe is the Netherlands, 0.9. Human Development Index goes from 0 to 1. So it's quite high, whereas Bulgaria, which is the poorest country, still has a Human Development Index of almost 8. Not so much due to its income, because income per head of the population is low. No, because of traditionally rather good education and also a performing health system. Not the same health system like in the Netherlands, but at least a rather well-performing health system. So this is the reason why the difference is not that large. If you compare with the human development gap within ASEAN, Myanmar as compared to Singapore, you see Myanmar has a human development index of 0.5, whereas Singapore has a human development index of almost 0.9. So you see again a huge difference also in human development, meaning that again the needs in Myanmar are completely different from the needs in Singapore. Of course, the needs in Bulgaria are also different from those in the Netherlands, but much less giving rise to different aspirations and different expectations than in the case of ASEAN countries, I would say. Now, this brings us to economic integration. I indicated already that from the start, the historical creed, as I would like to call it, of ASEAN and EU differed, right? Now you will see that also the way of integrating economically between the two groups of countries is different. First of all, when AFTA started in 1992, this was to a large extent private sector driven. Not completely private sector driven, but to quite some extent. Before that, in the 1980s, ASEAN progress was much more driven by governments. The economic cooperation schemes and so on and so forth were made up by bureaucrats and politicians and were just a little bit only, well, lobbied for by the private sector. But AFTA was completely different in this sense that the private sector was to a large extent behind that, or parts of the private sector. So this is quite important difference with the EU, because the EU, since quite a long time, actually the economic policies are made to a large extent within the European Commission, the supranational body in the EU. So this is more government driven. It is decided by the Council of Ministers, and it is decided and proposed and decided by the European Commission. So within the EU, this is more government driven, as I would like to call it. Now second, ASEAN is much more, in its economic integration process at least, is more open to other countries. It's what is called open regionalism. They want to include some way or another, loosely or less loosely or anyway, they want to include other countries. That's how ASEAN Plus 3 came into existence. That's how ASEAN Plus 6 negotiations are taking place now. That's how they become part of all of them, of APEC. This is the idea, open regionalism. It is regionalism, but it's open to other countries. The EU has a different process. Remember, it all started in the early 1950s with the creation of this supranational body for heavy industries, which later on led to the European Economic Community with the Treaty of Rome 1957. And the idea of the Treaty of Rome was to end, well, not to end, but at least to have, after a number of years, a customs union. Now, a customs union and a free trade agreement is something, well, it's not completely different, but it's different. A customs union has an external policy, an external trade policy vis-à-vis the rest of the world, whereas a free trade agreement, each member of a free trade agreement keeps its own tariffs and non-tariff barriers with the rest of the world, which is not the case in a customs union. In a customs union, this is unified, this is harmonized. So, in the EU, because of a customs union, this is not open to the rest of the world. A non-customs union member can only be involved if he also becomes a customs union member. There is no way to escape from that. So it is not open regionalism, it is more close regionalism, so to speak. Right? So this is a second important difference. A third difference is the decision-making process. In ASEAN, the decision-making process, well, remember this goes back to how it all started in the 1960s, mid-1960s, with the national leaders willing to pursue their own development agenda, not giving up national authority or national autonomy, right? So, still today, the decision-making process within ASEAN is a bottom-up decision-making process. The national leaders have to agree, and then decisions will boil out of that. Decision-making process in the EU, on the other hand, is a top-down decision-making process. It is, in terms of economic decision-making and in trade policy and so on, it is proposed by the European Commission, it is discussed and accepted in the European Parliament, and it is discussed and accepted by the Council of Ministers, and then it is implemented. So it is a top-down decision-making process. So again, reason to think that the two parties for an FTA agreement are what I would like to call strange bedfellows. Actually, this has impact on the way negotiations have been taking place up to now. So this slide shows you a bit the stages in economic integration. So free trade is a rather low stage of economic integration. On the other extreme, you have the economic union, which is the highest stage of economic integration. The deepest stage, whereas free trade is a rather shallow situation. In case of free trade agreement, tariffs and quotas, international trade tariff duties and international quotas that countries are having are eliminated among the countries. So elimination of tariffs and quotas among countries, yes. And you find this elimination also in case of a customs union, in case of a common market, in case of an economic union. But in a free trade agreement, there is, as I indicated, there is no external tariff, no common external trade policy vis-à-vis the rest of the world, vis-à-vis non-member countries. There is no eliminations on restrictions on factor movement, movement of capital and labor and technology and so on and so forth, right? So, and also there is, of course, no harmonization or no unification in a number of important economic policy and social policy areas, right? Well, obviously. In case of a customs union, this is one step further. First of all, tariff duties and quotas are eliminated between the member countries, but in addition to that, they have a common tariff towards the rest of the world. Now, this slide gives a bit of a, or this traditional way of presenting it is again a bit biased, because what I'm forgetting here is the role played by the non-tariff barriers, the technical barriers to trade, the norms and the standards and so on and so forth. In case of a customs union, they're still out there. When the customs union in the European Union was created at the end of the 1960s, all the countries had their own technical laws and standards and regulations and so on and so forth. And this was, of course, a severe and increasingly severe trade barrier. So when I say here common external tariff, yes, but non-tariff barriers is a different story. No elimination of restrictions on factor movement, no harmonization or unification in the field of a number of social and economic policies. Then the next step is creation of a common market. In a common market, also factor mobility, restriction of movement of the factors of production between the member countries is eliminated. But again, no harmonization or unification of social or economic policies. The final stage, economic union, there you have all these matters so elimination of trade barriers, a common external tariff, elimination of restriction of factor movement, as well as unification or at least harmonization of a number, not all, but a number of important economic policy matters like some taxation, monetary policy. Well, for instance, in the EU, at least to some extent, you have, with the euro, you have a number of countries who have at least a common monetary policy. Of course, not all 27 member countries of the EU are part of the Eurozone, and therefore are not all EU members today have this common monetary policy, but at least there is quite a lot of advance made in this field. So, if you look at the picture of the EU, I would say economic union, yes, but here we are halfway. But even in the field of non-tariff barriers, the technical barriers to trade and so on and so forth, most of them, if not almost all, among the member countries of the EU are removed with the creation of the European single market in the early 1990s. Now, if you look at ASEAN, the situation is completely different. You're going to have an economic community or an economic union, I don't know, it's called ASEAN Economic Community in 2015. Is this going to be an economic union? Not quite. Because, yes, there is elimination of restrictions on factor movement. Skilled labor is allowed to move from one ASEAN country to another country, but there still remain huge restrictions. I recently heard the story of a Malaysian architect who hoped to have his do his services in Thailand, who had to become, of course, member of the Association of Architects in Thailand. In order to become a member, you have to do an exam, and that exam is in Thai. So there are still quite a lot of restrictions to the free movement of factors of production. Common tariff? No. No, of course not. I mean, it's not a customs union, it remains a free trade agreement. Of course, with the spread of the free trade agreement with all kinds of partners outside of ASEAN, the number of countries with which tariffs are important is reducing, but still it doesn't mean that there is a common external tariff. So I would say, not quite. ASEAN Economic Community is not really an economic union, for the reason I just indicated. Now, this brings me to the long and winding road to the EU-ASEAN FTA. Well, EU and ASEAN countries have been trading partners and cooperation partners for quite some time, of course. If I would be in a bad mood or having a bad character, I might even go back to William Shakespeare and say maybe misery is on the basis of it, because maybe the position of the EU in the ASEAN countries is a bit threatened, and this might be a reason for now engaging in this free trade agreement. That's not exactly true. But if I would be really in a bad mood and having a bad character, I might provocatively say so, but it's not correct. But still. So, this road to EU-ASEAN free trade agreement is a long and winding road. It actually started, at least for the outside world, it started in 2007 when the then commissioner, European Commissioner Peter Mandelson, in a speech in Kuala Lumpur for the Chamber of Commerce, stated that a good cause could be made for this kind of free trade agreement. And so I believe he said in May 2006, I believe that the case for an EU-ASEAN FTA is a strong one, and I will put it to the European member states. Because this is a decision-making process in the EU. So the initiative was coming from Peter Mandelson. Remember, top down. And then the next step was, of course, the European Commission. Almost 6 months later, which made a formal request by the European Commission to the member states of the European Union for a mandate to initiate the negotiation process. Again, this is illustrating the top-down decision-making. The initiative is coming from the top, but of course, the member states have to agree with that. But then, once this mandate is formulated and it's clear what is within that mandate, the European Commission is the only negotiator in this process, not the individual member countries. The mandate is there, and it should be clear. Then, third, in 2007, the Council of the European Union, they gave the green light. And that's why in May 2007, the negotiations, the inter-regional negotiations, because now we are talking of negotiations between the EU on the one hand and ASEAN as a group of countries on the other hand, started in May 2007. From the beginning it was stated that the EU-ASEAN FTA was going to be well, this was at least the intention of a number of the negotiators to be what is called a new generation of WTO compatible free trade agreement. WTO compatible, these are just words. Of course, FTAs are WTO compatible. All member countries are WTO members, so they cannot deviate, they cannot violate the World Trade Organization agreement. So they should be WTO compatible, but it's a new generation, it's going beyond WTO commitments. Of course, it's about securing better market access, but more importantly, it's trade barriers, tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers, goods, services, investment, government procurement, intellectual property rights, all these areas are going to be covered in such kind of agreement. That's why it is called a new generation of WTO compatible free trade agreement, because normally the free trade agreements are restricted to goods and maybe the coverage even is rather restricted. Quite a lot of free trade agreements don't have agriculture or a number of agricultural products included, for instance. Well, this is not going to be the case here. Third important aspect of this new generation of WTO compatible free trade agreement is that the negotiations were with 7 ASEAN countries only. So the 3 poorest countries were left out of these negotiations. The idea was they need something else than free trade agreement. So negotiations started with ASEAN consisting ASEAN 7, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Brunei, Philippines and Vietnam. Now, of course, before you start negotiations, you make sure that there are benefits coming out of these negotiations. That's why a study was made by a group of consultants using economic models to find out what are going to benefits for the 2 parties. Now, what came out of this study, which is a study of 2006, remember, negotiations started in May 2007, and we are talking about a number of years ago. So it was shown that the EU 25 was actually, according to a number of scenarios, only marginally going to benefit from an FTA. On the other hand, the individual ASEAN countries was going to benefit rather in an important way, with growth rates as in 2020 higher 2.5% for ASEAN as a whole. But there is something which I would like to draw your attention to already, because I will come back to this much later, but then I can remind you of this. The rest of ASEAN is, of course, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, also Brunei. And there the impact is very low as compared to the other ASEAN countries. Just keep that in mind, because we will come back to this later on. But at first, the first picture that comes out of this is that, well, for quite a lot of the ASEAN countries, the impact of these ASEAN-EU FTA will be important. Right. Now, the negotiations started in May 2007. Now, after a couple of negotiations, it became quite clear that not sufficient progress was possible for a number of reasons. First of all, as I indicated, the economic interests at that time, and still today, of the partner countries within ASEAN differ in such a way that they have a different agenda during the negotiation. And also the institutional situation of the 2 groups of countries is different. Remember the decision-making process. In order to get something done, the decision-making process is completely different. In the EU, the ASEAN member countries were confronted with one voice, but from ASEAN side, voices might be different. And so negotiations proceeded rather slowly. Although there was some progress, actually it was considered not to be enough. Second, because of that, well, actually before that, already after the start of the negotiations. To be fair, I must tell you that even in the EU there were economic interests, some sectors, which were lobbying for the bilateral approach, not the interregional approach. And that's why I'm talking about the long and winding road. They were willing not to have the long and winding road. They wanted to have a quick road to results, to benefits, not the long road through interregional negotiations, which are very difficult. And so, for instance, don't convey this message outside of this room, but for instance, the European service sector was against the EU-ASEAN FTA negotiations because they said this is going to take too long. By the time we reach something, the United States is going to take over everything over there. What's in for us? So they wanted to do it quickly. And so they were rather in favor, well, they were in favor, they were lobbying the European Commission for the quick road rather than the long and winding road. Now, for all these reasons, I'm not saying this is the major reason, but for all these reasons together, the interregional, the long road was temporarily abandoned. And so it was decided in 2009 to finally have a bilateral approach, that the EU was going to negotiate bilaterally with a number of ASEAN countries. Now by that time, now we are talking 2009, by that time the EU-Korea FTA was almost there. The EU-Korea FTA actually came into practice in December 2010, right? And so, once of a sudden, it became clear that, of course, this FTA was a kind of, or might be, a kind of template, or a kind of blueprint for an FTA with the individual, at least with some individual ASEAN countries, not all ASEAN countries. Because it also became clear from the outset that the EU-Korea FTA was of course an FTA with a developed economy, another OECD country, not with a developing economy. So it might be useful to use this kind of template with Singapore, but it might completely be useless to try to use this template in negotiations with, say, Indonesia, for instance, or even with Thailand. Okay, let's have a look at what came out of the EU-Korea FTA. Well, first of all, it was signed in October 2010. Sorry, I was mistaken. I said December, it was October. So October 2010, and the implementation started in July 2011. And the idea is in 20 years to have almost complete elimination of all tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers for goods, services, have intellectual property rights included, government procurement included, and so on and so forth. And so in 20 years, 99.9% of EU-South Korea bilateral trade will be duty-free. That's the idea, right? This is going step by step. I mean, in 5 years from now, something like 98.7% of all import duties are going to be removed. Of import duties are going to be removed. So it's going step by step. But the end is going to be 2031, 99.9% of all trade going to be duty-free. Now, the EU-South Korea FTA, with regard to non-tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers, well, this is not going, at least not in terms of ideas, beyond WTO. It's following WTO, but what is important is that it contains a number of specific chapters on specific sectors, going deeply into detail how to liberalize, how to remove the non-tariff barriers. And this is the case for consumer electronics, for motor vehicles, for pharmaceutical products, and for medical devices, and for the chemicals. So for these sectors, these are all sectors where the non-tariff barriers, the technical regulations and norms and standards are tremendously important, of course. Well, for these, very detailed provisions are there in the EU-South Korea FTA. So in this sense, it's going well beyond WTO. Although it's not giving new principles, the principles are not going beyond, but the practice, the details are much going beyond the WTO. With respect to trade in services, there the agreement is also going beyond WTO commitments, especially in a number of areas which I'm listing here, like in telecommunications, which you will find in Singapore. With respect to environmental services, the same in Singapore. I mean, now there is an EU-Singapore FTA. I should have told you at the beginning, of course, sorry. There is now an EU-Singapore FTA. The only problem is nobody knows exactly what is in it. I mean, I will come back to this. I have to rely on interviews and on press conferences and so on to find out what is in it. But I haven't seen the text yet. I mean, it's still in preparation. I mean, there is agreement, but now the legal advisors are making the final draft. So, but I know for sure that telecommunications is in a similar way regulated in the EU-Singapore FTA as in the EU-Korea FTA. The same with, or more or less the same with environmental services, shipping, and so on and so forth, also financial services, all transport services, and how law firms are going to be allowed to do business. All this is in the EU-Korea FTA, and in this sense, quite a lot of this, I'm sure, but I cannot show it to you already, but I'm quite sure quite similar arrangements are in the EU-Singapore FTA, of which immediately more. Now, what is also new in the EU-Korea FTA are what is in it about intellectual property rights, mostly with respect to patent rights and the terms, I mean the time period during which patent rights are going to be protected. And when a foreign applicant for a patent is doing his application with the other partner, the local producer of the generic product cannot possibly use the data, the information that the applicant in the country is providing. So this is the second. The data exclusivity provision prevents generic drug manufacturers from relying on data used by the patentee for market authorization. So this was also quite novel. Second thing, and I'm going to talk about this on Thursday in much more details at the conference which is taking place at NIDA, relates to the so-called Sustainable Development Chapter in the EU-Korea FTA, which really is, I think, a precedent for future FTAs with individual ASEAN countries, but also for the EU, ASEAN as a whole later on, hopefully, because this remains basically the idea, the strategy of the EU in the end, to have a new ASEAN FTA. Now, negotiating bilateral FTAs with a number of ASEAN countries, but in the end, bringing them all together into EU-ASEAN FTA. So the Sustainable Development Chapter in the EU-Korea FTA, which is a precedent for future FTA with ASEAN countries, states, and this is the quotation, each party shall seek to ensure that laws and policies provide for and encourage high levels of environmental and labor protection consistent with the internationally recognized standards or agreements referred to in Articles 1. Then you have a number of articles, of course. But what are these conventions about? Well, these are the ILO conventions on the so-called core labor standard conventions, freedom of association and collective bargaining, abolition of child labor, no discrimination of employment and occupation, and so on and so forth. Or multilateral environment and agreements also are among them. Now, these are not so much a problem, and also, as we will see, most of these ILO, but some of the ILO core labor standards are still reluctantly applied in a number of ASEAN countries. So, this brings me to the next step in my presentation, which is how far are we now with these negotiations between the EU and the ASEAN group of countries? Well, first of all, remember we are just talking about potentially 7 ASEAN countries, because 3 ASEAN countries are not involved in this yet. Now, so as I indicated, in 2009 it was decided to go for, well, to deviate from the long and winding road and go for the, well, maybe not so quick road, but at least the quick results road with negotiations with specific individual ASEAN countries. And it was, so the idea was that in the end, as I indicated, the individual EU agreements with individual ASEAN countries could be combined into an EU-ASEAN free trade agreement, right? Could be upgraded into a region-to-region agreement. Right, so as I said, the EU negotiations with Singapore ended successfully. The EU negotiations with Malaysia and Vietnam are still underway. And the negotiations with Thailand started on the 6th, well, officially started, were launched, so to speak, on the 6th of March of this year. So this is where we are. The Philippines, Indonesia, and Brunei still are in the process of agreeing with starting negotiations. So what is the status of these negotiations then, and what lessons can be drawn from this for Thailand? Well, as I indicated, I can only rely, as far as the EU-Singapore FTA is concerned, I can only rely on the information I got from talks and interviews with people in embassies at the European Commission, because I don't have the text. The text is still under embargo. Right. So, first of all, it's from what I heard, what was reported to me, the EU-Singapore FTA touches on most trade-related issues such as tariff reduction, non-tariff barriers, public procurement, provisions on rules of origin, intellectual property rights, and so on and so forth. So all these things which we called before new generation WTO FTA are in the FTA with Singapore. Second, and this I think is new, is that the Singapore FTA is the first one to be branded a green FTA. Green FTA because, first of all, the sustainability chapter, which takes for granted that the partner countries are going to respect a number of important multilateral environmental agreements, right? But also there are provisions for green growth and the reduction of trade barriers, non-tariff barriers, in the renewable energy sector, including this chapter on sustainable development. So that's why, at least in the press, this FTA is called the Green FTA. Right, so also the service sector is widely going to be liberalized along the same lines, more or less, although the details evidently are going to be different with the EU-Korea FTA, but along the similar lines as what is provided in the EU-Korea FTA. This one thing, market access for investment, has been negotiated as well, but there is no agreement yet for the simple reason that there was no mandate. At the time, the final agreement was reached from the European Commission about that issue. So this chapter has not been finalized yet, but it's quite obvious that it's going to be finalized. Now there were, and this I think is the most interesting thing for Thailand, what were the hurdles during these negotiations? Well, based on my information, there were two major topics which took some time to reach agreement. The first hurdle related to what is called geographical indications. Champagne. Champagne is a wine, a sparkling wine from a specific region in the EU, and no other sparkling wine in the world is allowed to use the name champagne. So this is a geographical indication. Singapore, it's a kind of intellectual property, right? But it's not relating to a brand. It's a region which is giving the name to the product, right? So it relates to intellectual property rights, but it's different in a sense also from intellectual property rights. And so that's why it was for Singapore complete, but for many countries in the world, it's rather new to have this included in free trade agreements. From the European point of view, it was quite important, because they have quite a lot of these kind of things to protect. Now the problem for Singapore was, okay, if we accept this, then we have a list of geographical indications to protect. We have to make our own list of geographical indications to protect. But this is only going to be binding in our relations with the EU, because outside of the EU, our list is not protected at all. So they have to make quite a lot of expense in having this list without that much benefit outside the EU. So this was the first hurdle. In the end, they agreed. The second hurdle related to the ASEAN content cumulation. This is also new. What is ASEAN content cumulation? Well, remember, Singapore is a small city-state at the top of the bottom of the Malaysian peninsula, so it's a major port, right? And so quite a lot of goods are imported in Singapore for re-export. Now, before that, the EU, this is the situation of Singapore. So Singapore will benefit when products coming from other ASEAN countries can pass through Singapore into the EU under the EU-Singapore FTA. If the EU would say, no, only Singaporean products can enter the EU, then what's the benefit for Singapore? What is Singapore producing? Just a little bit. Of course, Singapore is producing something, but there's quite a lot of trade going through Singapore to the EU. Now, there was, of course, a precedent in the generalized system of preferences of the EU. There was a provision that products produced in a number of ASEAN countries, for instance, let's say electronics assembled in Indonesia, but with components coming from Malaysia, some other components produced in Thailand, still some other components coming from Vietnam, but in the end, all coming together in Indonesia and they're assembled into a computer, let's say, whatever. Well, this, although the assembling as such in Indonesia is just a minor part of the cost of production, let's say 10%, still it could enter duty-free or at a reduced tariff duty into the EU, because if you add up everything which was elsewhere in ASEAN contributed to the value, was more than, let's say, 50% or 60 or 60%. So the value added in, what was it, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, if you take them together, plus Indonesia, more than 50%, okay, you can enter the European Union under the GSP, if not duty-free, at least at reduced rate. Well, this was to the benefit of Singapore, and said they wanted to have something similarly in the FTA. And in the end, they achieved this as well. It seems, that's at least the information I got, that the European Commission, the negotiators, they agreed with this ASEAN content accumulation. So it will be possible that goods from other ASEAN countries, at least when Singapore also contributes to their value added, can enter the EU under the free trade agreement. The only thing is I have no further details, I cannot tell you more, so I would very much like to have more details, but at this moment I cannot tell you. Right. Now the sustainable development. Remember, the EU is combining two aspects, actually three aspects of sustainable development. When they talk about sustainable development, they don't just talk about the environment. They also talk about good governance, and they also talk about labor protection and human rights and abolishment of child labor. And so it's not just about deforestation and the environment and so on. No, it's also about no discrimination on the work floor against women or for political or the possibility given to workers to organize and to bargain collectively. These are core ILO labor standards. Well, this is in this sustainable development chapter. So, well, actually, to be honest, when this whole process started, I was a bit critical. I was thinking this is not going to work out. Singapore will not be willing to accept this, because Singapore is one of the countries which is actually has ratified only, let's say, I don't know the number by heart, but let's say 5 of the 10 core international ILO labor standards. 5 of the 10. Maybe it might be 4, it might be 6, I don't know, but around that 5. Now, if you are an optimist, you say, okay, they ratified 5 of the 10. But when you are a pessimist, you say, well, they only ratified 5 of the 10. Now, I was at the time a pessimist. I said, well, they only ratified 5 of the 10. If you want them to ratify the other 5, and you put this on the negotiation table, you run the risk that they are going to run away. But they didn't run away. They accepted. So I think this is really a breakthrough, and I'm sure this is going, well, I'm not saying I'm 100% sure, but let's say I'm 99% sure this is on a negotiation table also with Thailand. Now Thailand is in a somewhat better position. Thailand accepted or ratified somewhat more core labor standards, so less problematic, but this was definitely, at first for me, well, I consider this really a breakthrough, although it has at first sight nothing to do with trade, but still it is included in this free trade agreement. Then also, as I indicated before, I'm not going to repeat it, it's considered to be the first green FTA, so a number of provisions related to recycling, about liberalization of environmental services, waste removal, and so on and so forth. Now, negotiations with Malaysia. There were also some hurdles to learn from. Malaysia has never included anything in its FTAs about government procurement. So for them, this is completely new. Second, there are probably also different difficulties with respect to intellectual property rights, especially in the field of pharmaceutical products. So at this moment, well, as far as I was informed correctly, and I think I was informed correctly, this has created some animosity during the negotiations about these intellectual property rights. Also, these geographical indications I mentioned. Malaysia, like Singapore, has no such register of geographically such protected geographical indicators. So again, the problem is, for Malaysia, where are we standing? Are we going to accept this or not? Because if we accept this, we have to invest in it, we have to make our own register, which of course is going to be accepted by the EU, but outside the EU is of no value because it's not recognized elsewhere. In no other FTA that Malaysia has signed with other countries in the world is there any indication of these geographic indications. And then also services is going to be quite important for the EU because the service sector in Malaysia, of course, especially in financial services, communication and transport, is of crucial importance also from the point of view of the EU. Some other hurdles relate to, one of them relates to the environment, the palm oil sector, which is quite important in Malaysia, of course. Now the point there is that the EU is questioning the sustainability of the palm oil production in Malaysia because of deforestation which palm oil production is causing. And so the ecological footprint of palm oil used as biofuel, according to the EU, is quite important. And therefore, this of course is a crucial sector for Malaysia, so it's on the negotiation table and they have bad experience with the EU in the field of biofuel. So they are rather reluctant at this moment still to give in. The automotive sector, also of course, a sensitive sector from the point of view of Malaysia. They don't want to easily give up their protection vis-à-vis the rest of the world of their automotive sector. Yeah, investment as well. Now, negotiations with Malaysia are currently on hold due to sharp differences. Well, currently on hold, I'm not 100% sure of this anymore, because one of the reasons for being on hold was not only these differences between the EU and Malaysia, but another reason was the elections in Malaysia, which are now done. So probably they will be on track soon if they are already, if they didn't start already. So I couldn't check this, so I'm not sure, but probably they are still not taking place, but they will be resumed soon. Now with Vietnam we are not far at all, but again, also sustainability is on the table, also the service sector, intellectual property rights, all these issues are on the negotiation table. But again, the negotiations started quite recently, right? Started only a year ago, so although quite a lot of, well, at least according to the press communiques, quite a lot of progress was made, I'm not quite sure what this progress is. Okay. Now what are then possible sensitive issues in the FTA with Thailand? Well, first of all, the Sustainable Development chapter. This might be an issue to discuss to some extent. And here there are two things, as I indicated, what the actually EU aspires in the long run is that partner countries of the EU should ratify and implement a list of something like 27 international conventions. Now, as far as the environmental conventions are concerned, most of these are ratified and implemented by Thailand. As far as the human rights and core labor standards are concerned, some of them are not ratified or implemented. So this is going to be on the negotiation table. So 11 of the 15 core international labor and human rights conventions are actually ratified by Thailand, which is quite something. I mean, if you compare with Singapore, right? Singapore only 8 of these core international labor and human rights conventions. Now, there are some other things, fisheries, timber trade, environmental, and the environmental problems involved. This surely is also going to be on the negotiation table and might cause some problems during negotiations. The geographical indications, remember I indicated to you what it is about, geographical indications, and I gave you the example of champagne, but GIs are much wider, going much wider than wine and spirits. It's also about, for instance, Roquefort cheese, Serrano rum, Scottish wild salmon, Belgian Geuzeland big beer. I mean, all these names and all these processes of production are protected in Europe under this type of geographical indication. And so on the negotiation table is that all this also is going to be protected in Thailand. as it is going to be protected in Singapore. As most likely, I mean, it's going to be protected in Malaysia. So really this is again, in this, you have to, I mean, this is also quite new for Thailand. I checked the database of the EU, the so-called DOOR database, where all the GIs, all the geographical indications in the EU are listed. And I found one Thai product which is protected in the EU as a geographical indication, the cow homily. And 2 coffees are applied, applying for GI, but are still in process. So only a very few products yet from the point of view of Thailand are on this list, and therefore this is a completely new experience for Thailand. Now, this brings me to the last part, the position of the poor ASEAN countries, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar. Well, first of all, they're going to lose. Why? Well, for the simple reason, if there's going to be a free trade agreement with the 7 ASEAN countries, meaning that tariffs are 0, well, no, let me explain you what the position of these countries are, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar. These are least developed economies. They have access to the market of the EU for all products, everything but arms. So under that arrangement, everything but arms can enter the European Union free of duty, free of import duty. Right? At the moment, when the other ASEAN countries with the same products can enter the EU with payment of some or important duties. Now, when there is an FTA with the individual ASEAN member countries, duties will be 0. In other words, what is the benefit for Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar? There is no more difference between the tariff duties. I mean, what they are offering to the EU is as expensive as what the other ASEAN countries are supplying to the EU. So this is what is called preference erosion. So they are not benefiting at all from it. They can only benefit indirectly, hoping that when the ASEAN countries are increasing their trade with the EU, they might benefit from this indirectly because of also higher exports to other ASEAN countries. So, also, and here I come back now to what the figures I showed you almost at the beginning. Remember, these countries, according to the calculations, are not benefiting or only benefiting marginally from an EU-ASEAN FTA. This means that as a result of this EU FTA, the gap between the ASEAN, between this subgroup of ASEAN countries and the other ASEAN countries is widening. Because one group is growing more rapidly than these least developed economies. So somewhere or another, this has to be taken into account by the EU by giving kind of additional incentive and support and development assistance or whatever to these poor economies. But also, I would say, I'm sure it's also going to be on the negotiation table. Also here, something from the other ASEAN countries is probably expected. Thailand probably has also to do something supporting these poor more than what it's doing now, which is not much, to support these poor developing economies. Third thing, what is called the elasticity of the exports on the ASEAN 5 exports to the EU is marginal. What does that mean by that? It means that when exports of an asset, this is based on my own calculations, when ASEAN 5 exports to the EU are increasing with 10%, as a result of this, the Cambodia, Laotian or Myanmar exports will increase only with 1.2%. Because they are only to a limited extent part of these production networks. So they are not, again, not benefiting or only marginally from the EU-ASEAN FTA. Here you have some data which show this. So in terms of GDP, well, I'm not going to explain what kind of scenarios we are talking about because this will lead us much too far, but even in the ambitious plus FTA in the short run or in the long run, Cambodia, no benefit in terms of GDP growth. Laos, only in the long run, 0.01%, and Myanmar, the same. So very marginal impact on the rate of growth. So finally, in order to achieve an ASEAN-EU FTA, based on what is happening now, sooner or later, of course, well, probably later than sooner, evidently, all these already existing or future FTAs between the EU and the ASEAN countries have to be combined into a EU-ASEAN FTA, right? Well, there are also here some hurdles. Scope for tariff reduction in the non-neutralized preference, okay. Now here also, based on the ASEAN preferential trade agreement, the commitments for services are not going beyond the ASEAN framework agreement on services up to now, right? In the ASEAN preferential trade agreements, there is nothing about government procurement. So how this is going to be achieved? Well, I think the only way to achieve this is indeed by combining the individual FTAs between the EU and the ASEAN group of countries, because at this moment there is no scope for having this in a broader free trade agreement. The same with IPR binding provisions in the ASEAN preferential trade agreements. They are there with Korea, Australia, New Zealand and Japan. So again, this has to be implemented. Competition policy, there is nothing of major importance at this moment. So these are things which somewhere or another will have to enter the EU-ASEAN FTA, and I think these kind of things would never enter an EU-ASEAN FTA if the negotiations which started in 2007 would have proceeded. Because it's not going beyond what is achieved until now. It can only be achieved if the strategy is like what is followed now. You first negotiate with Singapore, you negotiate with Malaysia, you negotiate with Vietnam, you negotiate with Thailand, and in all these countries you achieve this. And then you combine the whole thing and you have it. So this is basically, I think, a right strategy. Although at first it took me some time to agree with this strategy. I was much more in favor of the interregional approach, but still, I think this is the right approach. So the issue is, again, in all these EU individual ASEAN countries, FTAs, what is the common denominator? Because this is going to find its way into the EU-ASEAN FTA in the end. What is in the mind of the European Commission? I have no idea. They don't tell me. Of course they don't tell me. They would be stupid to tell me, because if they tell me, maybe they could also tell anybody else. That's not how negotiations are taking place, right? So what is in their head? What kind of idea what do they want exactly to achieve? I have no idea. So what is there an EU blueprint at all? Is there a template? Probably not, but what do they have in mind? And still, because, and this is the disadvantage of the approach, the bilateral approach that is taking place now, there might be more or less important deviations from one FTA to another. And this in economics is giving rise to what is called the spaghetti bowl of free trade agreements. All these different rules and regulations and rules of origin and so on and so forth, which makes life for an international businessman very complicated. I can only hope that spaghetti bowl is not going to be combined with a noodle bowl. Thank you very much for your attention.
for Professor Ludo. So, do anyone have a question? Could you have a question and answer?
Sure, of course, yes. Sorry, my last slide should have been question and answer.
Please. Anyone? So, can I have the mic?
Sure, of course.
On behalf of the NIDA and the Research Center, thank you very much for your question. Oh, it's not a question.
Okay, thank you very much for your informative presentations and very, very interesting to me actually. I have actually three questions that maybe you don't need to answer that exactly because of that. I think maybe it's not quite obvious to answer. The first one is talking about intra-industry trade, which is going to play a very strong role in integration, of course. And if our intra-industry trade in ASEAN is pretty much lag behind compared to EU intra-industry trade. And it has been started for quite a long time, So do you have any suggestions on how to promote intra-industry trade between ASEAN? Actually, this is first questions. The second one, you talk about the original from ASEAN that come from most like the market-driven than the government-driven. So what is the pros and cons between that? And market-driven can be good in the ways that can be better moving forward, or should we rely on or should have more concentrate on government-driven in this case? And the last one is quite interesting. I just heard about the database of the GI, geographical identifications called what? That database that is
DOR.
DOR.
Yes.
And that's how Hungary Thai which is in the database. So to my understanding is if the Thai product is in that database, it's already automatically protected.
Yes.
How? I mean, of course, Thai you also have more GIs than Hungary, for example, Chaya Salt 8, for example, or another products. So how can they register in that? Because I think it will be going to be safe for them in that case.
Can I have your microphone? Now, regarding the first question about intra-industry trade, it is correct that indeed in ASEAN intra-industry trade is much lower and started later to evolve than, well, in the industrialized economies of, let's say, the 1960s, 70s, 80s and 90s. So I think this is quite natural that in this respect the ASEAN group of countries is what I would like to call lagging behind. So there is quite a lot of room for further economic cooperation and integration, and the production network to improve or increase the working of production networks in ASEAN. This has been done based on all kinds of initiatives under ASEAN already. I mean, to increase networking, production networking within the ASEAN group of countries. So it's most likely to improve in this way. Now, because of economic integration, the market also in the ASEAN countries is going to, the market within the ASEAN countries is going to benefit from it. So there's also a good reason to think that as a result of this, production networks within ASEAN are going to increase as well. Of course, because of these free trade agreements and a lot of products from the rest of the world are also entering, and the ASEAN group of countries is increasingly used as a kind of production base, not just for exporting, but also for supplying to the domestic markets into the ASEAN economies. So I would think that the intra-industry trade in the couple of years coming from now is going to increase rather rapidly, I would say. So there will be a rather important catching up effect. Sorry, I forgot the second question. Can you?
Market driven.
Oh yes, of course. Benefits and disadvantages. Well, The advantage of, let's say, market-driven or to a large extent private sector-driven is that it takes into account the aspirations of the private sector. It's not something which is happening outside of them. I mean, they are involved and they are the first parties to be interested in it. So they are pushing for that. So this is a huge advantage. The disadvantage of market-driven is that, of course, within the private sector, I mean, the balance of power between the various companies and the sectors differs widely, and so there are much more pushy, or some can push harder than others, and so the end result, not necessarily, and actually most likely, is not in the interest of everybody. That's I think, the disadvantage. The advantage of the other alternative is that there is, let's say, a more coherent outcome. But the disadvantage is, of course, because it being top-down, it takes longer to be achieved, and there is also going to be maybe opposition, and sometimes really important opposition against a number of, this you also might experience here in Thailand. But this, I mean, both have advantage and disadvantage. I personally, I would rather, I'm much more in favor, but of course I'm being a Belgian, I'm a European, so I'm much more in favor of the European system than what I see in Thailand. I think, well, ASEAN, I mean, what I think sooner or later a crucial decision has to be taken that ASEAN needs a kind of autonomy by itself, a kind of becoming a kind of supranational authority. Not a complete authority, but at least have some supranationality, which is lacking at this moment. So sooner or later, I think this step has to be taken. Then with respect to the recognition of GIs, what the procedure is, I'm not sure. I mean, this is on the website of the European Union. I don't know at all, but I think it's quite easy to apply for registration. And once you are registered, the Kao Mali, for instance, I mean, this type of rice cannot possibly, I mean, with this name, is protected now in the European Union. So it means that no other supplier of this, of rice can say, well, this is Kao Mali, and I'm selling it as such, because then he is in violation with the GI, which is protected. So this is the big disadvantage. And the whole issue is Kao Mali in Thailand sufficiently protected? I'm not so sure. I mean, what would happen if a rice grower is just packing his rice into a bag and saying this is Kao? I don't know how much it is protected in Thailand. I have no idea. I don't know. But so I don't know how it works. But so you might run the risk of having the same problem when this kind of rice is entering Europe. But at least the name and the origin is going to be protected. And so probably also from Thai side some initiative has to take to make sure that only the real Kao Mali is going to be exported to the European Union. But about the details of application, I have no idea.
So, any more questions? If so, thank you very much. It's a very clear and informative presentation, and we have a lot of topic to do the further research for your regarding to your presentation. So if no more question, I would like to invite Professor Priya to give a speech.
Okay. First of all, again, thank you very much, Professor Rudolph, for your informative and nice presentations from the ASEAN and EU partnership. Well, over the past few years, actually, Thailand has lots of forums talking about AEC for many aspects, and many forums also talking about also EU as a case study as well, because some people talking about whether ASEAN will be like EU or how it will be different, and also Eurozone crisis also makes people to think about, well, should ASEAN adopt the same common currencies or not? But anyway, So I think today's forum is much clearer in the sense that what ASEAN, including Thailand, has to be adjusted. So far, what you can see economic and social disparities between among countries seems to be make ASEAN far behind, to have the full integrations, especially the law regulations, the labor standards, and sustainability, essentially sustainable chapter, including intellectual property rights. So that's a country who needs to adjust themselves. So lessons learned from EU today also makes ASEAN, especially policymakers and the ASEAN also in Thailand should be able to find a way to have the full collaborations and to make ASEAN to be more very easy to make in practice. But actually, this is not the full role of NIDA. Actually, as the role of NIDA, we are the education institute. So our role is to prepare the knowledge and to provide and to produce students to work for the ASEAN in the futures, both skilled ASEAN, both understanding ASEAN, and knowledge sharing and providing learning organizations among ASEAN. NIDA ourselves also have the plan to be the part of ASEAN in that way. If you can see the new construction buildings, we will have the untapped 12 months ASEAN libraries in the 21st floor, which is the top of the building with a good coffee shop over there. So we hope that we can be fully operated by the second half of this year. We will open the ASEAN study centers, which is going to be focused on the research on ASEAN and also East Asia, that in the future as well. In the future, there can be some curriculum that will talk about ASEAN studies in the future as well. As the role of international college, we also have the majors of AEC, business management, in which also one of the majors that we provide to students, and we hope this major will be fully run more in the futures. And we also get the funding from the Thai government to run the training course for ASEAN's, ASEAN people, especially CLM and V countries to do in Thailand. So we start doing that for that as well. So this can be the part of the future starting of part of partnerships that NIDA as the school, as a university, will done for Thailand. So we happy that you showed your presentation today, and we like to everyone to give the hand of appreciation to Professor Rudo again in this case, please.
Thank you. Thank you.
And all my boss is just going away, so I have to be the one who give you the token of appreciations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And as a role of NIDA, I want to close this event. And actually, we have a number of series of public lectures that will be provided by NIDA and International College, NIDA and NIDA Research Center, which is also on the papers in your slide. And also, please don't forget to fill in the evaluation forms so that we come back to improve in our next event. Thank you very much, and good luck, and come back home safely.
Thank you. Thank you.